We begin with breaking news out of Syria, where opposition fighters in the north have entered the city of Hama. Government troops say they have withdrawn. Now, Hama has been a stronghold of the Assad government since the war began in 2011. Less than a week ago, opposition forces took control of the northeastern city of Aleppo in a surprise offensive, their biggest advance in years. Well, let's take a look at the changing situation in Syria. These areas in red are controlled by government forces. They're backed by Iran and Russia. Now, until recently, they've held much of the central region. The green areas show territory controlled by the opposition armed group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. Just a week ago, they launched a surprise offensive from Idlib, capturing Syria's second-largest city, Aleppo. The opposition is now pushing south. It's taken control of the city of Hama after several days of intense fighting. Now, Hama lies along a major highway linking the city to Homs and then the capital, Damascus. Moscow has responded by increasing airstrikes. In northern Syria, the yellow areas are controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, these are Kurdish-led fighters supported by US troops. They've been fighting against government forces and ISIL fighters in the area. Let's bring in Resul Serdar now. He's just north of the Syria-Turkey border near the Turkish city of Kilis. Resul, the rebels are in Hama. This is extraordinary. What more do we know about it?
Well, this is now the second largest, biggest gain of the opposition since a week after taking over Syria's second largest city, Aleppo, almost a week ago. Now, they are confirming that they are in the city, but more importantly, now the Syrian regime itself also is confirming that it has taken its forces out of the city. That practically means Hama falling under the control of the Syrian opposition. So this is changing the whole Syrian system. This is a collapse of the status quo in Syria that was established in 2016 when the Syrian regime took Aleppo from the opposition by the help of Iran and Russia. So now it has been a couple of days that there were fierce fighting taking place around the city of Hama, the fourth largest city of Syria, and the opposition was gradually getting closer and closer to the city. So the regime forces were building a military mass over there. However, their enforcement has not been enough. They could not stop the Syrian opposition. And also, early in the morning on, we have seen that the opposition from the north are just coming more and more toward Hama, and the opposition also was getting much more enforcement both from the city of Idlib and Aleppo. And as a result, now Hama is officially under the control of the Syrian opposition. So within a week, the Syrian opposition has taken the control of two large cities in Syria, and that is definitely leaving the Syrian regime and its backers, mainly Iran and Russia, in a very, very difficult position.
Because it's a major advance. What happens next?
Indeed, now, particularly after taking the control of Hama, the Syrian opposition fighters, we have been watching their videos and we also try to make some contacts. Now, they're saying that their next target is going to be Syria's third largest city, Homs, which is just 45 kilometers further south. And there is almost nothing in between these two cities because the only major obstacle for the Syrian opposition to advance further were the airstrikes conducted by the Russian military warplanes and the regime warplanes. And Russian warplanes are flying from the Hama airport, but the regime warplanes were mostly flying from the Hama military airport. And now the opposition is saying that they have taken the full control of that military airport as well. That means now the regime has less capability, or its capacity to bomb the opposition forces from the air is much more reduced. And that is making the opposition forces work absolutely easy. Now they're saying that they are going to march further south to take the third largest city of Syria homes. And if that happens, that is going to be a major blow for the Syrian regime. And of course, it's going to leave the capital of the country absolutely vulnerable.
OK, Resul, Serdar, many thanks for bringing us the latest lines from there. Let's bring in Robert Geist Pinfold. He's a lecturer in peace and security at Durham University in the UK, and he joins us from there now. Good to speak to you. Give us an idea of just how significant a win this is, Hama is, for the opposition, given that they never fully managed to take it. It remained under full government control during the whole of the highest points of the 10-year war.
Well, if the opposition manages to not just take Hama, but hold it, it would have such strategic and symbolic significance for the Syrian opposition, and indeed for the Syrian regime and its backers, starting with the symbolic implications. Now, you mentioned that Hama has been under regime control for a very long time, but actually Hama is also the birthplace of Sunni armed Islamist resistance against the Ba'ath Party and the Ba'ath regime of Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad. So it goes back a long time. And actually, Hama was leveled by Bashar's father in 1982, where it rose up, the city rose up against the Ba'ath Party, and basically the regime flattened the city, coining the journalist Tom Friedman's term Hama rules, where basically an authoritarian regime in the Middle East will ruthlessly crush any dissent. That killed, that offensive by the regime, up to 40,000 people. That's nearly as many Palestinians as Israel has killed in its offensive in Gaza over a year, but the regime did it in a month. So it would be significantly symbolic for them to take it, but also strategic. As your correspondent noted, taking Hama would open up the road to Homs, it would open up the road to Damascus, but also it would cut the Syrian provinces in half. Basically, Western Syria, the part that has access to the Mediterranean Sea, would be cut off from the rest of the country. And this is where the opposition has to be very careful, because Russia has a naval base at Tartus on the west of Syria. That is Russia's only naval base in the Mediterranean Sea. So I think if the rebels actually manage to advance that far, Russia may start to change its priorities and shift its attention away from fronts like Ukraine and towards making sure that naval base does not fall.
And Robert, as you alluded to, it's quite one thing to take a place and another to hold it. How difficult would it be for the opposition to keep these gains?
Well, at the moment, the opposition are doing very well, and that's simply because they're not really fighting the Syrian government so much. It's more like the Syrian government are kind of forces are melting away, much as we saw the Afghan National Army do so when the Taliban advanced to take over that country before the US left. The question is if other groups will step in to do the fighting for them or to back them up. We know that Russia is supporting them with airstrikes. Russia does not have that many troops in Syria, only 2,000 to 4,000, so they can't do the frontline fighting. Hezbollah, as we know, is on the back foot, trying to save its own position within Lebanon. So the question is, what other groups can jump in? Will we see Iraqi militias, for example, continue to cross over as they're doing at the moment? Will we see the Houthis throw their lot in with the Syrian regime? This is a key test for the so-called axis of resistance, but it could also actually drive Russia and Iranian interests closer together. As I say, if the rebels start advancing too far, Russia will either depend on Iran and its allied groups to stop the offensive and save the Tartus naval base, or Russia will do it itself. Either way, it will bring those groups closer together, exacerbating that geopolitical alignment in the Middle East between two rival camps.
Let's look at the rebels and who they are made up of. We've got this HTS group emerging as the dominant force, but also the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. Now, we know from the Syrian civil war that it's incredibly complicated and fractured within the country. What do we know about this particular fighting force?
Yeah, and I think it's important that you mention that, because people talk about the rebel offensive, but actually there are two rebel offensives happening at the moment. The first of those is the one that's getting most of the coverage, the HTS offensive towards regime-controlled territory, taking Aleppo, possibly now taking Hama. But there's also the SNA offensive in the east of the country against, and that's not against the regime, that's primarily against the Kurdish held parts of Syria against the SDF. Now, often HDS are claimed as a Turkish proxy. They are not a Turkish proxy. They are a jihadist group, but they have also been extremely pragmatic. They've built basically a quasi-state in Idlib. They've tried to reach out to minorities and basically style themselves less Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, more kind of Hamas in terms of pragmatic Islamist governance. The question is whether that will work in peeling off minorities. Remember, Syria is like Lebanon. It's a heterogeneous state made up of Christians, Alawites, Sunnis, and Shias. Now, many of those groups, particularly Christians and Alawites, are staying loyal to the regime because they're afraid of what would happen under Islamist rule. And that, often people talk about Iran, people talk about Russia, but that is the key reason why Assad remains in power today, because those minorities have stayed loyal to the regime. Now, the HDS might be making advances towards them to basically placate them, but there's still no obvious signs that these groups are willing to throw their lot in with Islamists rather than a secular regime, no matter how brutal and authoritarian it is.
Great to get your explainer. Many thanks, Robert Geist Pinfold, for joining us there.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.